I follow in the steps of Anne Hutchinson of Massachusetts and Mary Breckinridge, the extraordinary woman who established the Frontier Nursing Service Midwifery Corps in rural Kentucky, nearly 90 years ago, Kentucky. Those horse and mule riding midwives served 1,000 families scattered over 700 square miles of back hills territory when midwifery had already been eliminated in most of the rest of the country. This home birth service, because that's what it was, lasted for 4 decades before the home birth section of it was swept away following Mary Breckinridge's death. Her great project actually demonstrated that some of the poorest and most poorly nourished women could get through pregnancy with some of the best maternal-infant outcomes in the whole country, as long as midwifery care and midwifery education were organized along the lines that she prescribed, her model. There was not a single maternal death in the first 1,000 births, and the newborn death rate was extremely low as well. Be aware we're talking about both home prenatal care and birth services in the context of no roads, few if any bridges over the creeks, which were sometimes swollen with flash floods, no phones of any kind, no electricity, no running water, during a time when there mostly were no antibiotics, blood transfusions, no epidurals or fetal monitors. Quite an accomplishment, huh? Well-prepared midwives could recognize emergencies requiring hospitalization and surgery in early stages, allowing for transport in a timely way to a hospital. Unfortunately, the Frontier Nursing Service model did not sweep the country on the merits of its demonstrated good outcomes. If that had happened, I think sometimes I might have avoided the unnecessary forceps delivery that I was made to have, the one that made me search for a better way to have a baby. Few feminists of the 20s adopted the Elizabeth Cady Stanton perspective on birth, which also matched Mary Breckinridge's personal experience and philosophy. Listen to what Stanton had to say about her 6th child's birth. Born, of course, at home with a midwife, in attendance without any form of anesthesia. Quote, "I never felt such sacredness in carrying a child as I have in the case of this one. She's the largest and most vigorous baby I've ever had, weighing 12 pounds. And yet, my labor was short and easy. I laid down about 15 minutes and alone with my nurse and one female friend brought forth this big girl. I sat up immediately, changed my own clothes, put on a wet bandage, and after a few hours repose, sat up again. Am I not almost a savage?" For what refined, delicate, genteel, civilized woman could get well in so indecently short a time? Well, I think she had abandoned the corset long ago. Instead, the suffragists of the early 20th century fell for the fear-based approach to birth, and this was linked to the elimination of the midwifery profession, which had already pretty much happened. This was a development that took place only in the U.S. and in no other human society that we know of prior to that time. This unique experience soon led to an epidemic of overuse of forceps, so that the year that I gave birth, I was one of the 67% of women having a forceps delivery. My thought was if we were meant to be pulled into the world, nature would have provided a handle right here. In other countries of similar development where midwifery remained a respected profession, the forceps rate would have been 5% or less. So this was, for me and countless other women, imbalance at its worst, when the medicalized view of birth extinguished the midwifery knowledge of women's capacity to give birth, and thus prevented women from experiencing their own power in this way. Fear took over and paved the way for widespread ignorance and the spread of even more fear. Now, beginning in the 70s, when fathers started being allowed to be present at the birth of their children, forceps were replaced by a rising cesarean rate. Okay, so it was exactly 43 years ago today that we set out on that caravan that was mentioned.
Wow.
Now, here's a big difference between me and Mary Breckenridge. I was not already a public health nurse, as you know, and nor was I able to take advantage of a 4-month course in England in order to become a midwife. I couldn't get to England. But I was free to learn from any sources I considered relevant. I had no boss, but I had this wonderful mentor. And I eventually met some traditional midwives, learned from them and also from old midwifery books. I also learned from animals and doctors. And that is not in any particular order. My colleagues and I, for I recruited several, placed women's needs at the center of our policy making and found this way of organizing care yielded huge benefits for our babies as well as their mothers. We learned how to prevent complications by providing sensitive prenatal care. We learned how to alleviate pain with smooching, jokes, dancing, singing, and other things that you don't generally find in medical books, but really, really work. Here's one of my favorites. Why would that work? Try it a few times and you might be able to figure it out. At this point, let me say that my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, Ina Beard Stinson, who was the age I am now when I was born, was a strong role model for me. She introduced me to the women that she admired as soon as she realized I was ready to stop reading about animals and start reading about humans. So I had to read about Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Emma Willard, Susan B. Anthony, Clara Barton, Jane Addams, Helen Keller. And my other role models were those doctors who recognized that American women would be subjected to fewer forceps deliveries if we reincorporated midwifery into the maternity care package. I met on the caravan Dr. Louis Lapierre. I believe he's still alive. And I thought, Louis Lapierre at my door offering to teach me obstetrical skills? Come on in. We had a short course, and the next birth, everything he taught me was something I needed to use. Such a blessing that this happened. Etta Willis was another strong teacher of mine. She had got her midwifery training in Belize, and she was a district midwife in Guatemala when I met her in 1976. Her job was to supervise the non-literate traditional midwives in the high mountains, and she was humble enough to recognize that those traditional midwives had a superior way of dealing with the feared complication called shoulder dystocia. In plain language, that's the shoulders are stuck in the mother's pelvis when the baby's head is already out. The method that doctors used to teach at the time was break the collarbone. I'd never done that, fortunately, but her method was very easy to remember, and she'd learned it from these non-literate midwives. Turn the woman over to her hands and knees, and usually the baby will fall out. Why? Because the woman's pelvis is actually bigger from front to back in that all-fours position. I don't know that I would have thought of that on my own. When I went back now to ask those midwives where they'd learned it, they said, Dios, we learned it from God. So as I teach that to obstetricians nowadays, and they tell me, one of them told me, it's from God. And I said, actually, you're right. And gave them that story. Traditional midwives from the rural South or Southwest, I'm going to name some names: Margaret Charles Smith, Gladys Milton, Annie Lee Logan. All of those three have books telling their stories. were huge sources of inspiration for me and remain so. All of these midwives recognized, like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, that birth is a sacred event. And they comported themselves in such a way as to be worthy of such great responsibility. There's kind of a difference between this and the writing of Simone de Beauvoir, who deserves a lot of respect for how incredibly influential she was. But when it got to human reproduction, she described it as a passive role for a woman that wasn't, quote, an activity in a human. She was both plant and animal, a stockpile of colloids who couldn't take pride in what she created because she hadn't really made that baby. Now, you can probably tell that de Beauvoir it was her mind that meant the most to her. And the fact that she had never given birth made her less of an authority on that than she was in the area of her scholarship. Now, when we were discussing the role of the Six Nations women, Audrey Shenandoah, whom I mentioned earlier, used to talk about how raising and educating children was also a sacred task among her people. And making sure that the family was properly nourished was another biggie. These were sacred duties for women, ways of ensuring balance between male and female roles in life. You might be interested to know that among the Six Nations, only men could be chief, but only women had the vote. Interesting? Very balanced. It's not the only way of organizing things, but it's one way to achieve balance. Another was that only men would be warriors, but only women declared war. And the women did have also the power of impeaching a chief if this individual no longer deserved that office. Balance. Margaret Charles Smith, whom I mentioned earlier, grand midwife from Alabama, who lived to the age of 99, having attended more than 3,000 births in her 4-year career. She told me once that she was the only midwife in her area, so she had an amazing responsibility. And it took her away from her home, from her 3 sons, a lot of the time. When you're gone so much, she said, things go loose at home. She was right. In my own case, the demands of doing a good job of midwifery meant that my family time was sacrificed. I remember one Christmas when I had a breech birth downstairs, and when that one came, I had to go upstairs for another one. No Christmas meal for me, and time with my family that year. I'm sure that my absence kept me from listening deeply to some of the confusion that my sons particularly were experiencing at school, and some of the things they were learning about the role of men in the world. Why did it seem like men were being criticized for all the problems in the world? They told me these things later. I think they tried to tell me younger, but I didn't always hear. Why was competition seen as a bad thing? Why didn't we have organized sports? Were there any heroic men who looked like them and they could look up to? It was just a month ago, if you can believe that. I'm 73 now, right? And I stumbled across the work of a great woman thinker, writer, and former philosophy professor. And I'm going to mention her name here. I've never met her, but I've read all 4 of her books recently. Christina Hoff Sommers. Now, some have criticized her as being anti-feminist, but I think she's not. I think she perceives, as I do, that the sexes are different but equal. That we should always be seeking balance, not the domination of one by another.